Buenas noches a todos los que nos están siguiendo. Soy Rodrigo Campos junto a Fabiana Chu y en nombre de Tusanaje queremos darle la bienvenida a otro encuentro con Tusanaje. Hoy es un día muy especial porque contamos por primera vez con una mesa bilingüe, pues nos van a acompañar invitados angloparlantes. Todos ellos son Chinese Americans, chinos estadounidenses o estadounidenses de ascendencia china. Pero no solamente es importante su presencia por ser descendientes y miembros de la comunidad de Nueva York, sino que ellos tres son gestores culturales que han hecho un trabajo remarcable eh, que ha contribuido a la comunidad de los barrios chinos de Nueva York. Además, contamos en esta ocasión en la moderación, acompañándonos a una miembro de Tusanaje que es realmente extraordinaria. Ella es museóloga, ella toma fotografías artísticas, una excelente fotógrafa. La admiramos mucho, nuestra compañera Fabiana Chu. Hola, Fabi.
Hola Rodrigo, muchas gracias por esta invitación y por darnos tan gran bienvenida a mí y a los colegas de Nueva York que han estado haciendo este trabajo desde hace muchas décadas, ¿no? Bueno, en primer lugar, tenemos tres ponentes y los vamos a presentar tanto en inglés como en español. Pero quisiera primero saber ¿cuántos de ustedes en la audiencia han visitado al barrio chino de Nueva York? No sé si una de nuestras ayudantes desde el punto de vista técnico pueda decirnos, no sé si ustedes puedan ponerlo en los comentarios de Facebook, si es que han podido visitar el Chinatown de Nueva York en el pasado. A ver.
Perfecto. Fabi, mientras que vamos recibiendo las respuestas,
Sí.
por ejemplo, aquí tenemos una de Renzo Wong diciendo yo. Tenemos al menos un compañero que ya ha estado en Chinatown de
Sí,
Nueva York. Mientras
qué
vamos
bueno.
recibiendo las respuestas, te propongo irle contando a todos los que nos acompañan las reglas de esta mesa. ¿Puede ser?
Claro.
Muy bien, déjenme decirles que hoy contamos con un equipo técnico, los que estamos detrás de escenario, vamos a decir, en el backstage. Esta vez somos más, porque vamos a atrevernos a hacer traducción en vivo. No contamos con traductores profesionales, contamos con compañeros bilingües, miembros de la enorme diáspora china en las Américas, que han tenido la enorme voluntad y actitud de colaboración y nos están ayudando. Y nuestro interés es que quienes no entiendan inglés puedan saber las respuestas lo más simultáneamente posible. Estamos haciendo un esfuerzo enorme para eso y contamos para eso con un equipo especial. En este equipo, además de Fabiana y de mí, quiero presentar a quien va a ser el traductor que va a darnos una respuesta resumida de las respuestas de nuestros invitados cuando ellos terminen de hablar. Es decir, va a ser nuestro traductor más ortodoxo, vamos a decir. Él es Juan Hong Chung. Juan,
Hola, buenas noches.
muchas gracias, Juan. Luego vamos a tener a la compañera Tiffany Wang, que mientras nuestros invitados van a estar hablando en inglés, ella desde su Facebook, no desde el Facebook de Tusanaje, sino desde su cuenta personal, va a escribir en los comentarios frases o ideas relevantes que los invitados van diciendo y ella en tiempo real las va a ir poniendo en los comentarios para que no se pierdan durante las respuestas de nuestros invitados. Hi, Tiffany.
Ya puse un comentario en, en la sección de comentarios también.
Perfecto, Tiffany, muchas gracias. Y tenemos a una tercera persona trabajando esto, que es nuestra amiga Sabrina Lin, quien va a encargarse de los comentarios y preguntas que ustedes hagan en español y ella nos la va a dar en inglés ya traducidas para nosotros inmediatamente poder preguntar a nuestros invitados. Sabrina, thank you for coming here. Hello.
Hola a todos, soy Sabrina. Mucho gusto. I'm Sabrina. It's really nice to meet you.
Bien, y por supuesto, ayudándonos en la transmisión y todo lo demás, una compañera de siempre, Greca Lee. Hola, Greca. Bueno,
Hola a
Greca,
todos.
muy bien, Greca
Hola a
está.
todos.
Muy bien. Fabi, adelante.
Sí, bueno, quería también recordarles y hacerles una pequeña sugerencia. Cuando escuchen a estos ponentes, piensen si se atreverían a gestar programas similares, ¿no? En donde ustedes estén. Bueno, empezamos con las presentaciones biográficas de cada uno de nuestros ponentes. Empezamos con Amy Chin. Amy, can you say hi?
Hi, good evening.
Good. So Amy is a cultural leader who has worked both in nonprofit cultural organizations as well as governmental organizations. In New York, if you want to talk about the arts, you have to have Amy in there. If Amy tells you to be at a meeting, you have to show up. So that has been my experience with Amy, and it's been nothing but wonderful. She is a genealogist, and she helps Chinese Americans in the 3rd and 4th generations find their roots. She is also the board president of Think Chinatown, which you're going to hear a little bit more about. Amy es una de las dirigentes más importantes, dirigentes culturales y artísticas más importantes de la ciudad de Nueva York. Ha trabajado con organizaciones sin fines de lucro y con entidades gubernamentales. Como investigadora en el campo genealógico, ella ha apoyado a muchos chinos americanos a encontrar a sus antepasados y es directora de la junta del colectivo Think Chinatown. Rodrigo, ¿puedes contarnos más acerca de David y de Andrew?
Por supuesto. Next is David Eng. He's a marketing, communications, and public relations professional with many years of extensive experience in national and international for-profit and non-profit organizations. From 2007 to 2020, he was Director of Marketing and Communications at the Tiananmen Museum in New York. David Eng es un profesional de marketing, comunicaciones y relaciones públicas con muchos años de amplia experiencia en organizaciones con y sin fines de lucro a nivel nacional e internacional. Del 2007 al 2020 fue director de marketing y comunicaciones en el Tiananmen Museum de Nueva York. Además, also we have Andrew Rebatta, is associate curator at the Museum of Chinese in America, MoCA. Prior to joining MoCA in 2014, he was a program manager at the Smithsonian Latino Center and Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum and worked for 5 years in the collections department at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Andrew Rebatta es el curador asociado del Museo de China en América, MoCA, por sus siglas en inglés. Antes de unirse al MoCA, en 2014, fue gerente de programas en el Smithsonian Latino Center y el Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, y trabajó durante 5 años en el Departamento de Colecciones del Museo Nacional de Arte Mexicano. Adelante, Fabi.
Okay, so our first question goes to Amy. La primera pregunta va para Amy. How and why did the Think Chinatown Collective start? Are you all volunteers? And can you give us some examples of the activities you all organize? Now I'll do it in Spanish. ¿Cómo y por qué se da inicio al colectivo Think Chinatown? ¿Son todos voluntarios? ¿Podrías darnos unos ejemplos de las actividades que realizan? Now, I know, Amy, you probably want to show us a little video that you prepared for us, yes?
Yes, that's right.
Let's do that. I think we want to do that audio part too.
Amy, tienes que elegir.
No, we didn't have audio here.
Amy, can you hear us? I know Amy was having some technical problems earlier. I hear a little bit of audio. These are some of the activities of Think Chinatown, both bringing old traditions and new practices. And we'll definitely include the link of this video on the page so that you can watch it later. And hopefully the audio will work. And there's Amy.
Last year, through our partnership with Think Chinatown and StoryCorps, we produced 2 beautiful animations. Something that was really important to us is that we want to share these stories from the Chinatown community, told by us and lived by us. Presenting Chinatown grassroots art and connecting them to a wider arts living audience, an intergenerational audience, is really what Chinatown Arts Week is all about.
Very nice. Told by us and lived by us. How you doing, Amy?
I'm okay. Was that all right?
I think we were missing part of the audio, so we'll just post it later in the links.
Oh, okay. I don't know what
So
happened.
for the next one, we'll make sure that the audio plays somehow. So the question was, how and why did the Think Chinatown Collective start?
So this session,
Thank you. And are you all volunteers? And can you give us some examples of the activities you all organize? ¿Cómo y por qué se da inicio al colectivo Think Chinatown? Todos son voluntarios. ¿Podrías darnos unos ejemplos de las actividades que realizan?
I think Chinatown started out very organically, very grassroots way. Actually, Yin Kong, the director, is the mastermind behind it. And it was founded by Yin and also Olympia Moy, whose family operates businesses in Chinatown. And she grew up in Chinatown. And it was really a way of linking people in the Chinatown community intergenerationally. I would say that I'm one of the older members of Think Chinatown, and I met Yin at a community event. And Yin has worked in different communities around the world, and we talked about our love for Chinatown and about how we come at Chinatown from such different vantage points. So we think of Chinatown as being a physical place, but it's also a very spiritual place. It's a heritage neighborhood, and people, it's sort of like the blind man and the elephant. Like, the blind man like touches the trunk of the elephant and says, oh, elephants, they're very skinny and they're long, right? But somebody like touches the ear of the elephant and they say, oh, it's flat and it's really big. So everybody approaches Chinatown and has a different idea of what Chinatown is. And the idea of Think Chinatown was, how do we connect everybody? So we work in 3 particular areas. We work in an area of course, arts, culture, and heritage. But we also work bringing programs of civic engagement. making people aware of what is happening on a local level, a regional level, and a worldwide level that affects our neighborhood. And then the third area we work in is in economic development. Chinatown is a community of many small businesses. A lot of them are immigrant businesses, but some of them are businesses that have been around for many, many generations. So how do you find a way to find common ground for everyone? So some of the programs that we've done is, programs that touch the heart. So what you just saw was a video of our Chinatown Arts Week. And for Chinatown Arts Week, we produce different kinds of events that focus on the cultural heritage of Chinatown. And in addition to producing our own events, we put it under this umbrella of Chinatown Arts Week, and we incorporate into a calendar events that are produced by other people in Chinatown. So for example, Museum of Chinese in the Americas, where Andrew works, we have their events on the Chinatown Arts Week calendar also. So some of the events might be food-based. So we've done zongzi making classes, zongzi being the Chinese tamale. And we've also done, we've commissioned animations and cartoons based on stories. We do storytelling, we record people's stories, and we present them in different ways. And then, there are some things that are, less sexy. So we do programs, for example, recently with COVID-19, we've been translating a lot of the government help program information into Chinese and trying to disseminate it to residents and business owners in Chinatown. A lot of government agencies have put forward these guidelines for assistance, but a lot of times they are only in English, or some agencies simply tell people, oh, use Google Translate, which, I mean, this being a program that's bilingual, you understand that Google Translate isn't always accurate. And then one of the programs we're currently doing right now is called Assembly for Chinatown. So in the economic development realm, we've been working with volunteer architects and also volunteer workers and artists in the community to help small minority-owned businesses to create outdoor dining structures. And you can see a lot of examples of these programs on our website, thinkchinatown.org. It is largely volunteer run, it is volunteer driven, but of course we believe in paying professionals. So on a project to project basis, we also pay artists and we pay other professionals to help with the work. But what's really great is we have some young people and we have older people. We have people who've grown up in Chinatown all their lives. We have people who've grown up in outside communities where there were no Asians, but really feel that Chinatown is their home in a spiritual way. And for some of them, they've moved here and they live in the community now. And I also want to say that New York has many Chinatowns. We focus on Manhattan Chinatown, which is the oldest Chinatown.
And in fact, we're going to hear more about that from Andrew later. So we were talking about translations. Let's give Juan a chance. He is going to do not a word for word translation. He's going to summarize Amy's wonderful answers.
Buenas noches, muchas gracias. El colectivo Think Chinatown comenzó orgánicamente por Yin Kong y Olivia Moy, que son personas del barrio chino. La misión de Think Chinatown es juntar a personas de una forma intergeneracional, es decir, jóvenes y adultos y mayores que tienen un amor al barrio chino, no solo físico, sino también de una forma espiritual. Toda persona tiene experiencias muy distintas al relacionarse con el barrio chino. Y es por eso que el colectivo Think Chinatown trata de reunir a todas. Especialmente se encuentran con proyectos en el área de arte, cultura y herencias, así como también actividades cívicas y de desarrollo económico. Uno de los proyectos más recientes alrededor de COVID-19 es traducir documentos del gobierno al idioma chino, así como también el programa Assembly for Chinatown, donde tienen voluntarios. Muchos voluntarios son artistas, arquitectos, profesionales, jóvenes y adultos mucha gente que ha vivido por generaciones en el barrio chino y gente que viene de fuera. Gracias.
A ti, Juan. Rodrigo.
Continuamos. Cool. David, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, David. We got a question for you. Can you tell us about the Lower East Side Tenement Museum and how it helps tell Chinese American stories? ¿Podrías, por favor, contarnos acerca del Lower East Side Tenement Museum y cómo este cuenta la historia de los chinos americanos de ese barrio, please?
So before I do that, I will also show you a video first.
Oh, great, great. Can you share the screen? Okay, here we go.
From the way we eat, to the way we worship, to the way we live, and the way we work. There's not a single part of American life that hasn't been affected by immigrants, migrants, and refugees. The fact is, America wouldn't be America if it wasn't for the contributions of real people who came from elsewhere in hopes of creating a better life for themselves and their families. The mission of the Tenement Museum is to tell the uniquely American stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the ongoing creation of our nation. In 1988, a woman named Ruth Abram found a dilapidated building that had been condemned for over 50 years at 97 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Between the years 1863 and the end of the 20th century, we estimate that over 10,000 people lived in 97 and 103 Orchard Street. There are thousands of stories that we might be able to tell between these two buildings. Stories that help us understand the evolution of the Lower East Side as a neighborhood that helps us explore American identity.
I think one of the most amazing things about the Tenement Museum is the power of place, that you can actually walk into the recreated homes of people who truly lived in these buildings and not just hear their story, see their information, see pictures of them, but actually to stand, to be in the place where they lived and look around at what their home may have looked like. That's what is really crucial for us here, is to create that story, bring visitors in so that they are immersed in the story, so they make a connection with the story.
I think that people who come here, whether they have a notion of what immigrants, migrants, and refugees went through or not, inevitably are moved because of what they hear. And they can identify with these stories. Our visitors always say that they see the parallels and the correlations to their own lives, no matter where they came from or what country they currently live in. They find some commonality in these stories because it's everybody's struggles. The Tenement Museum is looking into the future and looking at how we can spread the story beyond the walls. We know that there are immigration stories all across this country. Without immigrants and migrants and refugees, America wouldn't be what it is today.
The thing that unites all Americans is hope. Hope that we can create a better society and a better life for our descendants. Regardless of where we came from or our historical experience, I think America is a nation that's founded on the hope of a better life.
That's great. Thank you, David. That's a great introduction to this project. Can you please tell us more about this?
Yeah, so as you can saw just now from the video, the Tenement Museum uses this historic landmark tenement building down on the Lower East Side. And for those of you who have been in New York before, know that the Lower East Side and Chinatown are literally right next to each other and have basically in a lot of places formed to become one place. And because of the Lower East Side being such a hub for immigrants throughout the years, there have been many, many different populations that have lived down there, including Chinese people. And the Tenement Museum actually uses actual families who lived in this historic tenement building and have recreated the homes in which they live in order to tell their stories. The idea for the museum has always been to make the connections for people between real stories, real personal stories, and how they correlate to people's stories today. Because what we have found is that over the years, immigrants, refugees, and migrants who come to the United States have usually come for the same reasons, looking for a better life here in America, looking for opportunity. And the hope of the museum is to make those connections for people and help people also to understand that immigrants of the olden days are not that different from immigrants today, who are still coming to this country, looking for the same things, having the same hopes and dreams. And so the museum really tells the story of American immigration through these personal stories. And all the visitors that come to the museum often talk about how, they originally thought that they wouldn't be able to identify with the stories that they ultimately hear about, but at the end of their visit, they really truly begin to understand that the connections are there and that everybody has a very commonality in terms of what they look for and what they seek for in their lives. So the museum really is very much a way to tell that story.
Great, thank you, David. Now, Juan, please, your turn.
El Museo de Tenement, que queda muy cerca al Lower East Side en Nueva York, es adyacente al barrio chino. Este museo está basado en edificios a los que se llaman tenements, donde inmigrantes vivieron en años anteriores. Como ustedes saben, Nueva York ha sido un lugar con muchos inmigrantes, incluyendo también a la inmigración china. Tiene inmigrantes, migrantes y personas refugiadas. En este museo se cuenta la historia de cómo vivieron. Estas historias no son tan diferentes a los inmigrantes de hoy como a los inmigrantes del pasado. Gracias.
Okay, thank you, Juan. And thank you, David. I think we might have not said David was born in Cuba. David nació en Cuba. ¿Eres cubano? Sí, David?
Sí, yes, that's about all the Spanish that I know and can remember.
Sí will get you very far with this group. So very, very good. So our next question goes to Andrew Rebatta. Andrew, I should say, we already introduced him, but I should also add that he's one of my favorite New York Tucson people. His father is from Peru and his mother is Chinese. So Andrew, can you tell us about how the Museum of Chinese in America started? ¿Podrías compartir cómo es que nace tu museo?
Yes, gladly. I'm going to share a screen. I have some slides I'll be showing everyone. Can you guys, is that working? Great. Excellent. Okay, so what you all see here is on the right side, that's the Museum of Chinese in America today. We moved into this space in 2009, but MoCA was actually founded in 1980. And on the left side, you see the original museum space. We are located, we were located on the second floor of that old school building. It's actually Public School 23. It was built in the 1890s in Chinatown and is right in the heart of Chinatown. That building also houses a number of other community organizations, as well as our collections. Well, it housed our collections until January of this year when we had a catastrophic fire that gutted the entire building. So now there are a number of community orgs displaced, and a couple of the floors of the building are missing. But luckily, we were able to recover a large percentage of our collection. We're still sorting those materials out and figuring out the conditions of them, but it looks promising, you know, despite my description of the catastrophic fire. In terms of our founding, so we were founded in 1980 by Jack Chen and Charlie Lai. Those two individuals actually met in an Asian American cultural organization called Basement Workshop, which was in Chinatown, and it was comprised of artists, activists, cultural producers, and that's where these two young men met. And they decided to start a museum. Well, they didn't really decide to start a museum per se, but they wanted to start doing exhibitions in Chinatown that reflected the community. The community back then, you could say it was a lot of working class Chinese. Also a lot of laborers working in places like hand laundries, which were also kind of closing at the time. And they were also working in restaurants and garment factories and other sort of vocations and spaces. But when they decided to start doing exhibitions while working at the Basement Workshop, they really wanted to focus on this community. And one of the things that happened when they started what was then called the New York Chinatown History Project, emphasis on project, you know, that's something that implies something kind of temporary. They wanted to put together exhibitions. And while they were doing that, the founder, Jack Chen, would walk around Chinatown, walk by the office and notice that there were a ton of like materials just being thrown away in trash cans and dumpsters near the museum. And the image on the left, the Olive apothecaries, at the time was one of maybe the longest operating apothecary in Manhattan. And you know, they just discarded this amazing sign, and they began to think to themselves, well, you know, we're working on exhibitions about this community, and we also want to think about this community before it was even Chinese. And Jack Chen picked that up, and it became part of the collection in 1982. But he kind of picked it up, not really thinking that they would start collecting objects in general as a museum. That sort of happened the following year, and the images on the right that you see are of the top middle and the top right are in the Samwa Laundry located in the Bronx, New York, and that is Mrs. Chin, the mother. And the reason why the New York Chinatown History Project visited their hand laundry was because like a short time prior, her husband was murdered during a robbery, and they wanted to close the hand laundry. And they called Mocha to see, you know, is this stuff that you guys want? But at the same time, Mocha was doing a documentation project. So the reason why these images looked so amazing was Jack Chen and his team and Charlie Lai and his team and their team, they were documenting Chinatown through photographs. And in a very like sort of socially engaged approach. So they visited the laundry and they listened. They listened to the family. They learned about the store. They learned about the story of the family. They were there to comfort them in a way. And I think that was something that they didn't expect. And so moving forward from this time period, family collections became a very important part of our museum. And the bottom center is an exhibition called 8-Pound Livelihood about the history of hand laundries in Chinatown and the Chinese community. So they were able to kind of organize these shows, but they were learning at the same time. This is a very new thing. We're talking about early 1980s. And they you know, collected all these items from the Samwa Laundry. And on the bottom right, what you're actually seeing is a shirt press that is on display at the museum today. So we're seeing these stories, right, from early on in the museum, where we're learning about how the museum founders were kind of learning on the job. And that work continues today and very much informs the logic of pretty much everything we do, from programs to exhibitions. In these slides, you'll notice, well, first you might notice the top right, that person might look familiar in a very stylish jacket, that's Fabiana, going through materials at a closed theater called the Sun Sing Theater, a very important theater in Chinatown. It was a place where you can go see Cantonese opera and catch the latest action flick from Hong Kong. In the top left, you know, I was talking about this more socially engaged approach. You know, it went from kind of dumpster diving and collecting from what was around them to actually bringing people together and really focusing on Chinatown as a place, and Chinatown before it was Chinese. And the top left, that is a reunion of former students from PS23, the building I was talking about earlier that sadly burned down earlier this year. And you can see one of the old alumni there. But what was interesting about this and the sort of intent behind the Chinatown History Project was they didn't want to just inform New York City or the greater sort of public about Chinese American history. They wanted different waves of Chinese immigrants to learn about the preceding generations of Chinese in New York. You know, so creating a sort of dialogue between different, between Chinese and non-Chinese and between different Chinese groups. Something they really noticed at the time, even before the founding of the museum, was, you know, they were looking in places like New York Public Library, the Museum of City of New York, the New York Historical Society, and they were not finding any information about the Chinese community, a community that has been in Chinatown since the 19th century. And that really inspired them to, you know, make up for that lack, which today the museum makes up for that lack of sort of historical knowledge in public schools, which, you know, a lot of our public school students do not learn about Chinese American history. They do not learn about the Exclusion Act. They do not know about these early waves of Chinese immigrants. And that's part of the reason why MoCA was founded, to make up for that. Just to quickly go through a few more examples of this sort of salvaging of materials in Chinatown. Bottom right, that is a store sign with, you know, a couple artists and one of our executive directors. And the bottom left, those are personal belongings from a bachelor in Chinatown. And a lot of people might not know this, but before the Immigration Act of 1965, which, you know, opened up immigration to a lot of non-Europeans, you know, Chinatown is very much a bachelor society. And I'd love to hear more about Peru's or Lima's Chinatown in regard to that history. And just to finish, you know, a lot of the things they were saving, if you look on the right, at the right image, you'll see a lot of the store signs that were being saved by, you know, the early museum staff. And on the left, that is the same space, but is a picture of our collections, our archive, and what it looks like. So just a little bit of a before and after, but, you know, it gives you an idea of the kinds of things we were just finding around the neighborhood that people didn't see value in. And just to finish, that is the one thing that MoCA really tries to communicate, is that the everyday lives of our residents are important. A lot of people do not understand that their story is really important, even if they're like, you know, and that their materials are important and can really tell us about a time period, a place, and their family's history. And just to finish, here's the fire and some residents looking on. This is just really tragic evening, but luckily, like I said, we recovered most of the collection and we're in the process of moving into a new collection space.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And of course, many people in the audience and amongst the speakers participated actively in helping the museum get back on its feet after that fire. Muchas gracias, Andrew, y por supuesto muchos de nuestros participantes y de la audiencia participó en la tarea de rescate de este museo del incendio que sufrieron a principios de año. So Juan, you're up now.
Gracias. El Museo sobre los Chinos en Estados Unidos, conocido como MoCA por sus siglas en inglés, fue fundado en 1980 por Jack Chin y Charlie Lai. Comenzó inicialmente en un edificio compartido con un colegio público y otras organizaciones comunitarias. Lamentablemente, como Andrew nos ha hecho saber, hubo un incendio muy trágico Sin embargo, muchas de sus cosas han podido aún mantenerlas. Los fundadores decidieron comenzar exhibiciones que reflejen la comunidad del barrio chino a través de un proyecto del rescate de la historia. Ellos se dieron cuenta de que en el barrio chino muchas cosas estaban siendo arrojadas a la basura y comenzaron a coleccionar estos objetos. Comenzaron también a documentar el barrio chino a través de fotografías, visitaron lavanderías, donde comenzaron a rescatar objetos familiares. Así los fundadores, a través del tiempo, aprendieron a crear un estilo donde comenzaron a reunir objetos para contar historias de personas y del barrio chino. El objetivo del museo no es solo informar al público en general sobre la historia de los chinos en Estados Unidos, sino también informar a diferentes grupos y olas migrantes a saber la historia de los que vinieron anteriormente. Se han inspirado mucho en la historia de los objetos personales y tratan de dar como misión que los objetos y la vida diaria de las personas son muy importantes en la historia. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Juan.
Thank you, Juan. So we're done with the first round of questions, and I'd like to share some of the comments from our viewers. First of all, we got some viewers saying hi from Lima, from Sacramento, from Guadalajara. And also we have some people here that I can see. Yep. For example, tenemos comentarios from Amy K. Núñez saying, yo también, from the question if have you visited the Chinatown in New York. Tenemos saludos de Langman León. Tenemos saludos de Julie Nanetti. Hola Fabiana, gracias por la invitación. Esta presentación es muy interesante. Hi Fabiana, thank you for the invitation. This presentation is so interesting. Thanks for these awesome interviews, says Wilfredo and Jessica Mons. Greetings from Hillside. So great that this is happening, especially so great to see you, Amy Chen. This is Marilyn White. We have from Mexico, Julio Chian. Saludos cordiales para todos. Betsy Wu, buenas noches, mis paisanos. Saludos desde Sacramento. Tenemos aquí también Julia Wong Kong, this Peruvian Chinese poet. She says, I wish I could go there someday. Saludos de Juan Diego Zamudio, de Antonio Chan. Extraordinarios los eventos que organiza Tusanaje. Well, let's continue with the second round. We have a question, and the question goes for Amy. Yeah, we're gonna talk about everyday Chinatown. I don't know, Amy, if you can share with us a video first.
Yes, and hopefully the sound will work this time.
Yeah.
This pot, when I first looked at it, I just fall in love because of the shape. And the first time I saw it was at a doctor's office in Hong Kong. It's pretty, but smells awful because they boil this, I don't know what kind of herbs they put in there. I just told myself, do not get sick, because if you get sick, you're gonna have to suffer. I drank it, but the best thing is you get a few golden raisins to go afterward because it's so bitter. Never had golden raisin before. I never had it again. Only when I drink this awful stuff. But my family never had one. We never used them. I go to people's house, I see them, and I ask them, what do you do with it? Then I see on the streets and the store out front, people sell these things. I was like, maybe I'll buy one to do something else with it. But maybe someone will scold me for doing something else with something you're not supposed to do. So I kind of don't want to buy it. I kind of want to be reminded of the golden raisins.
也可以叫茶煲，但係更多嘅用途就係藥煲。喺老一輩嘅中國人呢，多數順中醫，食中藥， 用呢個去煲藥。喺我空灘喺鄉下用，而家就唔用啦。細個嗰時呢就係經過8年嘅抗日戰爭逃亡，有時從呢個鄉我就走去台山，我媽媽又好，佢哋都要用呢啲啊。特別細個嗰時呢，身體好弱，營養唔夠，咁啊差唔多成年都離唔開呢個煲嘅。食藥啊，嗰時冇，亦都冇乜西藥，所以就見到呢個煲就好懷念嗰啲艱苦生活嘅。
We use joss paper to honor the dead. The newer ones nowadays are pretty fancy. People started making different objects with paper. Houses, cars, clothing for all 4 seasons, and shoes with socks, jewelry, and just you name it, they make them. Every year when we go visit my mom at the cemetery, we would bring lots of joss paper. My mom liked to play mahjong, so every year we would get her a set of mahjong. My mom never lived in a house. She always lived in an apartment, so we bought her a house. But in addition to buying a house, she has to own the house, so we have to buy a deed for her on which we would write down my mom's name and she would own the house. Among other things that we buy for her every year are a Rolex watch, passport, a Ferrari. We can't just buy her a little Kia. We have to buy her a good car and lots of money and gold nuggets.
呢啲紙簿呢，就係攞嚟燒嗰時，即係祈求上天，鄉下話天公保佑全家嘅平安，呢個化險，即係唔好受到一啲戰亂啊、天災啊各個方面嘅侵犯。無論老人又好，細路都好，都係祈求上天保護，天公保護，所以就係。中國人嘅一種信仰就係靠呢啲，每年嘅年節啊、喜慶時候都用呢啲。過年過節又好，平時有咩苦難都好，拜神都係用呢啲去燒啲寶，祈求呢個保護，得到保護，得到保障。
Great, Amy. Please, can you tell us more about this project? Por favor, Amy, cuéntanos más sobre este proyecto.
Sorry.
No problem.
Great. So Everyday Chinatown, we've been doing this for 3 years, and it was a way of connecting the community, which I think is really a theme of what Think Chinatown does. Sometimes I talk about it as where the mortar between the bricks. And the idea was that in New York Chinatown, you have a lot of tourists that come through, and they might buy some trinkets, they might visit the museum, they might have a meal, but there's not a lot of in-depth interaction or deeper understanding about people. So we think of Chinatown, I mean, it has a long history, but it's also a living community. So I know there are a lot of Chinatowns worldwide that are almost like museums. And it's not a place where people live or work or go to school in anymore. But Manhattan Chinatown is, special that way in that it is a living community. So how do you connect a lot of these outsiders with the people that do call Chinatown home? How do we share the history? How do you make an outsider an insider? So the original incarnation of the Everyday Chinatown project was to focus on everyday objects. Now, these are everyday objects to many Chinese people. Like, how many of you recognize some of those objects in that video, right? The medicine pot or the joss paper. So we focus on these everyday Chinese objects. And we went to senior centers and community centers, and we interviewed older people. And it was a very simple conversation. Tell us about this object. What is it? What do you use it for? Tell us a story about it. And so in the same way, we try to connect outsiders and insiders with stories, we're also connecting generations. So an older generation with a younger generation. Andrew spoke about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act in America separated a lot of families. And I know in other countries too, that there was a lot of exclusion and a very fraught immigration history for Chinese. That meant that some of us didn't grow up with our grandmothers. Some of us didn't grow up with our parents because of the immigration history. So this was another way of connecting generations through stories. So we recorded these stories, these interviews, and then we commissioned artists to illustrate them. So for example, that last, the video you saw was a artist named John Lee. And John is interesting because he's a Chinese American and he grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, but now lives in New York. And we had him illustrate it, and then we created these videos. But in the first incarnation, it was really audio. And what we did was we took these everyday objects and we put them in storefront windows in Chinatown. So it was just the audio and it was the object in a window. And one of the windows was a eyeglass store. Another one was a grocery store. And so we take these everyday objects and we built a kind of beautiful display around it. So to elevate this everyday object. I mean, some of the other objects we had used was an ear pick or a tea set. And in that first year of Everyday Chinatown, we put these objects in windows, and then we did one of these call-in audio tours with a cell phone. So it's a service that you can use. And we had a sign that says, if you want to know more about this object, dial this number, press 1 for English, 2 for Cantonese, 3 for Mandarin. So everyday people, tourists or residents walking past the window could see this object and then call in and hear the story. So we did that the first year. Then this year with COVID-19 is when we started doing the illustrations, because this year, Everyday Chinatown couldn't be a street level event because there weren't people on the street. So instead it was a virtual event, and we commissioned these illustrations, these animations, and we put them online. And that's the video that you just saw. It's been really great because we've had people of all different ages and from different backgrounds saying, wow, you know, oh, I really identify with that object, or I didn't know about that object. And you can see that we have grandpas and grandmas and aunties and, you know, people like you and me telling the stories of these objects, and we all have our own stories about it. So it was a way of making the everyday accessible.
Thank you, Amy. Now, Juan, your turn.
El proyecto Everyday Chinatown o Barrio Chino a Diario tiene ya 3 años y intenta conectar a la comunidad del barrio chino con la idea de que en Nueva York hay muchos turistas, pero ellos no tienen interacciones reales con personas. La comunidad del barrio chino en Manhattan es una comunidad viva. Entonces, para conectar a los visitantes con personas de ahora, se han tomado objetos del día a día. Se entrevistaron también a personas mayores para que hablaran acerca de estos objetos. Y así intentan conectar a muchas generaciones en Estados Unidos. También estos objetos sirven como un puente para personas que han vivido a través del acto de exclusión de Estados Unidos. El Chinese Exclusion Act es un acto que separó a muchas familias chinas. El video que ustedes vieron fue del artista John Lee, que creció en Memphis pero ahora vive en Nueva York. El audio y el objeto fueron colocados en muchas ventanas decoradas en Chinatown, donde existía un servicio para poder llamar y aprender más de los objetos en inglés, cantonés o mandarín. Por la pandemia, ahora se han creado videos como el que ustedes han visto para que puedan ser accedidos a través del Internet. Gracias.
I also want to add that there are many other videos. So if you want to go to thinkchinatown.org, you can see other videos. And this year, I want to give a shout out to Tenement Museum because our online event was a partnership with the Tenement Museum. So it really expanded also our audience too, which is really wonderful.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan and Amy. Amy estaba invitando a todos a que vayan a la página de web de Think Chinatown porque hay muchos más videos como esos y la gran mayoría son bilingües, ¿no? En inglés y en chino. Quería compartir con ustedes unos de los comentarios que estamos recibiendo también online. Por ejemplo, Sandra Cheng dice, so proud to be Chinese Peruvian. Janet Jimenez says, congratulations to Tusanaje on the initiative and organization of the meeting with luxury guests. Hello, Amy, Andrew, and David. The projects are so inspiring, united not only by the physical and spiritual space of New York's Chinatown, but also by affirming the identity of its inhabitants and drawing a line of continuity between the past and present. Julia Wong says, I think in Chinese culture, keeping objects at first seems like a very practical practice, but the more I'm considering it, I think it could be more of a spiritual meaning, almost as if the objects are keeping the community company. Celia Wu says hello from Seattle, and Sandro Reyes says excellent conversation as always, congratulations. Let's move on to our next question. We have two more that we have prepared, and then we'll open up for questions you may all have. Vamos a la segunda pregunta para David. I also wanted to say there's a breaking news for David. He has accepted the position of Director of Communications for the GLSEN, the Gay and Lesbian Independent School Teachers Network, and he will start shortly on that position. Tenemos una noticia flash de David Eng. Él ha aceptado el puesto de Director de Comunicaciones para la red de maestros gay lesbian de escuelas particulares. Congratulations, David.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Yes, absolutely. So wanted to go back to Chinatown. You know, we just observed the 19th year since 9/11, since the attack on the towers. You worked in Chinatown in the aftermath of 9/11. Can you tell us about the challenges that Chinatown faced after 9/11, and what advice would you have for anybody handling crisis or recovery communications? You know, I've often felt that the Chinese in the diaspora are often one moment away from the next community-wide crisis. Be it whether it's COVID or whether it's a fire or whether it's an attack. Now in Spanish, trabajaste en el barrio chino que se encuentra a escasas cuadras de las Torres Gemelas, y justamente acabamos de conmemorar el 19 aniversario del ataque a las Torres Gemelas. ¿Qué retos afrontó el barrio chino tras los ataques? ¿Qué consejos tienes para aquellos que manejan comunicaciones en momentos de crisis? Mira, a veces pienso que las comunidades chino-americanas, las comunidades chino fuera de Asia, siempre terminan afrontando retos que requieren una respuesta comunitaria, ya sea COVID o sea una emergencia sanitaria.
Before I share some images with everyone, let me just give everyone just a little bit of background as to sort of what basically happened on 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, Chinatown is literally right next to the area where the World Trade Center was. So as a result of that, Chinatown was basically cut off from a good rest of the city, from most of the city, because many people could not go below 14th Street or go downtown. And so therefore that meant that most people couldn't get down to Chinatown. Chinatown, of course, is a living community, but also relied and still does rely heavily on, as Amy said before, tourism and people who come in from the outside to go to the shops, to the restaurants, eat, buy things. And when 9/11 happened, that effectively stopped. So all the businesses began to suffer in the neighborhood. Those people who lived in the neighborhood also had to deal with a lot of health issues as a result of it because they were so close to the two towers falling. So as a result, over time, after 9/11, almost every other neighborhood in New York City came back to pre-9/11 economic levels. So businesses returned, life returned basically to almost every neighborhood except Chinatown, because Chinatown remained cut off from the rest of the city for quite some time because there were many, many months of folks not being allowed down or traffic being diverted. So as a result, people were just avoiding Chinatown totally. And so businesses began to suffer. So as a result of it, and Amy Chin actually has to be credited for a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about now, because it was really Amy's brainchild to sort of pull together an effort, get funding from the government to create an organization that would then really focus on the rejuvenation and the rebuilding of the neighborhood. And part of what went into the rebuilding and the creation, sort of bringing life back to this neighborhood, was this whole idea of helping people really understand what the neighborhood had to offer, right? I think Amy alluded to it before about this whole idea that, people have certain ideas of what Chinatown is or isn't, what it has and what it doesn't have. And what the work that I worked with Amy on was really to create a brand, for want of a better way of describing it, right? Sort of to use very basic marketing and advertising terms, is to create really something, an entity and a brand that people would really begin to be able to understand, find the ways to be able to promote and market both the neighborhood, what the neighborhood had to offer, in a way that was accessible to people as well. So, and one of those things, so if you could bring them that first image that I have, then I can begin to talk about some of the efforts that we did around that.
So Greca, those are the images. Greca, esas son las fotos que mandó David.
Ya, ok.
Compartir
Sí.
mientras él habla, sí. Gracias.
Estos no.
There we go. Basically what we began to do was to create materials and to create a brand so that it would seem exciting to people, right? So as you can see from some of this, it makes it both accessible to a broad audience. So we wanted to make sure that we could convey the feeling of the neighborhood, but also make it in such a way that would actually make it accessible for a broad Western audience. We also created sort of a map, signage, and wayfinding so that people could find their way down to the neighborhood, understand what Chinatown actually covered, and what the highlights were that people should look for when they came down to the neighborhood. And then the other thing that we also did was we created, and this is really, again, Amy's brainchild, was to create events to be able to bring people, give people a reason to come down to Chinatown. We created something called Taste of Chinatown, where all the restaurants would bring their food out into the street, and we had basically had a gigantic street fair throughout the neighborhood. And then that next photograph also that has people on a stage, if you could go to that one. Yes, and we also created something, or Amy created something called Lunar Stages, which really brought performing arts back down to the neighborhood. And we did it in a park, so that it was free and open to everybody, and it gave people a reason to come to the neighborhood again. So these are just some of the things that in terms of really the idea, I think, in terms of, and certainly in this kind of a crisis, is to give people a reason to come back down, right? Because I think one of the things to remember is that, and Amy talked about it before too, we have now many Chinatowns in New York City. And also in New York City, you can find Chinese food and Chinese things almost everywhere and anywhere now. So there really is less reason sometimes for people to go down to Chinatown, because I think when I was growing up in Chinatown, which by the way, Andrew is showing the ES-23, the building where the fire was. I went to 1st to 3rd grade there when it was still an elementary school. But when I was growing up in Chinatown, there really was, if you wanted Chinese food or if you wanted some kind of Chinese experience, Chinatown was really the only place to get it. Now, it's very much a diverse city in terms of the culturally, things are everywhere, people have access to things. So there's really less reason now for people to specifically go to one neighborhood to access one kind of thing. So we really had to come up with reasons to bring people back down. And these events, creating a website that you saw some of the examples of the branding, that really then was able to get people to feel much more comfortable in accessing what was available down in the neighborhood. So, certainly for Chinatown, I think it is still a struggle. So I actually don't want to make it sound like all the problems are now over and everything's back to normal. I think it's still a struggle for the neighborhood and for the community in terms of bringing people down in the numbers that they used to have. And also because of the economy being the way it is, I think it's much more difficult for small businesses to be able to often, have the opportunity to be able to grow and to flourish, when rents are high and so forth. So I think these are all issues that have to be dealt with. And I think, but I do think that you have to find that commonality that people can find a link to connect to something, right? I think the most successful storytelling and the most successful way of marketing and promotion is to be able to put a human face that people can both recognize and both make connections to, and that this is not just some sort of far off foreign place that they really don't have an understanding to. And sort of what Amy just talked about in terms of the storytelling of common objects is really another way to do that, right? This is the whole idea is that help people understand what's my connection to this neighborhood, what's my connection to what's available down here, and that it's not just Chinese New Year, the only time that you want to come down for a day, right? There have to be every ongoing connections that are made. And it's not just done through the marketing and the communication. So my piece of it often is just one piece of it. The programming and the content, such as the kind of things that we just talked about here, is vital to having that kind of vibrancy in the neighborhood.
Wow, you just heard a masterclass in a couple of minutes of communications and handling some challenging issues, including putting a human face to a situation, finding those connections. Thank you, David. Juan, ¿qué me dices?
Bueno, David nos ha contado un poco acerca del contexto de lo que pasó después del 11 de septiembre. Para los que no conocen la ubicación geográfica, el barrio chino está muy cerca de las Torres Gemelas, donde aconteció este ataque. Lamentablemente, el barrio chino quedó cerrado por mucho tiempo después del ataque y la comunidad sufrió mucho por esto. Muchos negocios cerraron, no había turismo. Es por eso que él ha trabajado junto con Amy Chin en proyectos para revitalizar el barrio chino. Crearon una estrategia de comunicación para poder dar a conocer el valor del barrio chino a las personas en Nueva York. Crearon materiales para promoverlo para todo tipo de audiencia, no solo la audiencia local, sino también turistas. Crearon eventos como el Taste of Chinatown, probar el Chinatown, y también trajeron artistas para atraer visitantes nuevamente. Esto es muy importante ya que en Nueva York existen 3 barrios chinos y puedes encontrar comida también fuera del barrio chino. Entonces, después de la tragedia del 11 de septiembre, fue muy difícil para varios negocios poder reactivarse. Aunque ya mucho ha mejorado, todavía hay mucho trabajo por hacer, especialmente por la situación económica actual del COVID-19. Gracias.
Thank you, Juan. Great, great. That's great. And we're going to continue with a question to Andrew. Andrew, are you there? Yeah.
Hello, yes.
Great. Andrew, please, can you tell us about the exhibit you are currently working on for 2021, the one about New York Street Chinatowns? Por favor, Andrew, ¿podrías compartir con nosotros tu próximo proyecto? Que es una exhibición acerca de los 3 barrios chinos de Nueva York.
Great. I'm going to share a screen. Share. And actually there are, according to some sources in New York, we're up to a dozen Chinatowns. And a part of that whole sort of, promotion of these Chinatowns is something that we really want to trouble and problematize through this exhibition to a large degree. But for the sake of, just sort of the scope of the show and the sort of digestibility, we are focusing on the 3 largest and the 3 oldest. So Manhattan's Chinatown, there's also a Chinatown in Flushing, Queens, and Sunset Park, Brooklyn also has a Chinatown. This exhibition is looking at the sort of similarities and differences between them since 1980, as well as how are they connected. But really the impetus for this exhibition has a lot to do with the sort of rapid changes that are happening in all 3. And trying to get at how do we understand neighborhood change? How are we participants in that change? And what sort of visions for the future do a lot of the residents have? And how are they trying to shape that future? The images you see on screen right now show 2 neighborhoods, or actually 3. Flushing in the top left. What you're looking at there is a recent Black Lives Matter counter demonstration against a pro-police rally that was happening about a month ago. On the top right, you see a party happening in Manhattan's Chinatown in a Chinatown mall, which has a lot of vacancies. But I don't know if this is happening in Lima, but Chinatown in Manhattan is becoming an incredibly hip place. And the sort of branding that we were referring to earlier, the exhibition is trying to think about the effects of that branding, not just by Chinese, but also non-Chinese, but the non-Chinese store owners and residents in the neighborhood. In the bottom right, that's just a street scene from Sunset Park, Brooklyn. It's just to give you a sense of the architecture there, how it may look a bit different from Manhattan's Chinatown, but also is the most similar to Chinatown and is often considered an extension of Manhattan's Chinatown, primarily because of the Fuzhou immigrants that began arriving in the 1980s and that expanded Manhattan's Chinatown eastward until maybe the 1990s when, because of gentrification and also because of a certain level of marginalization of that community by the older Cantonese speaking, predominantly spoken language of Cantonese, sort of community in Manhattan's Chinatown. And in the bottom left, that is an image of some announcements about schools in Sunset Park. And I'll get into that relevance in a second. All of these images were taken by artists. As part of the exhibition process, we are commissioning artists, designers, just concerned residents, researchers to document these neighborhoods. But during the pandemic, a lot of ideas about this exhibition have changed. While looking at neighborhood sort of networks, and sort of not just networks, but also like neighborhood aesthetics and all those things, we began to realize that there are these networks that exist well beyond the borders of each of these neighborhoods and between the neighborhoods and even internationally, which is very important to consider the sort of foreign capital being sort of arriving in places like Flushing and Sunset Park, and how that affects the built environment, but how that also attracts more Chinese immigrants for different reasons. The reason why I mentioned the Black Lives Matters protest in the top left is because this is an example of, what you can't see here is that there are a number of actual business associations supporting the pro-police rally, while you have a lot of younger activists who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, showing up and counter demonstrating. But the other sort of layer to this image is it's happening in front of the Queen's Library in Flushing, which for that community, there are a number of historical landmarks. That community goes back to the 17th century. But the Queen's Library in Flushing represents the future of that neighborhood. It's a de facto town hall, if you will, where lots of these sort of community issues are brought to the public in front of the library. It's also in the center of the downtown, which is, for Queens, is the busiest transportation hub in the entire borough and the busiest transportation hub outside of Manhattan. And for those of you I don't know the right numbers to compare those things to, but it's a very busy intersection. I actually grew up right by it. And the top right, I mentioned the party happening in Chinatown and how it's kind of cool. Well, this artist, Philip Poon, has been exploring the shared spaces of Chinatown, but also how Chinatown and this sort of almost orientalized sort of understanding of Chinatown and this sort of, desire to have electronic music parties and have fashion shoots in front of buildings that are old with Chinese script, with Chinese laborers outside, this sort of issues around that, but also how do we as Chinese Americans also sort of perceive what Chinatown is, and Philip would be the first person to tell you that even he has a lot of conflicts with, his involvement in the neighborhood, whether it's activism or his work as an architect. The bottom right, I think it's just a really nice street scene, but it's also pointing to, Sunset Park being an extension of Chinatown. And Chinatown, a lot of people say, is aging in place. With gentrification, a lot of people are moving out. They're looking for more space, especially if you have a family. There's also the Fujianese community that speaks Mandarin and the Fuzhou dialect, having more support in this neighborhood, which has grown immensely since the 1980s. And it's a younger neighborhood. It's a very young neighborhood. And one of the things this exhibition is going to do is provide that comparative information. How many Chinese residents are homeowners versus renters? What is the average age of a household? What is the, that sort of data sets that would bore most, but through that sort of through this work, we're going to not only be able to share personal stories, but sort of provide a foundation to understand those stories, to sort of reinforce some of the narrative we're putting out there with this actual concrete data. And in the bottom left, this is a photo by artist or photographer Wayne Liu, who 2 decades ago documented Flushing for us. I reconnected with him, and now he lives in Brooklyn and is exploring the Sunset Park neighborhood as well as Chinatown. But that's another thing about these neighborhoods that I neglected to mention, is that Sunset Park is sort of viewed generally as more working class, but it is sort of under different pressures from surrounding neighborhoods that are a lot more affluent. And also Brooklyn is a sort of brand these days. I don't know if the Brooklyn brand has reached Lima yet, but it's known as kind of being a maker space, a place for artists and community, the artist community to kind of have studios and sort of thrive in, because there's a sort of gallery ecology there as well. And the bottom left, I wanted to just point out this bulletin board because it's still a very common form of communication. So another thing this exhibition is doing is looking at common forms, such as bulletin boards, such as other things in the built environment like stainless steel gates, which are kind of ubiquitous in Chinese neighborhoods in New York, particularly outside of Manhattan. And I think I've probably taken up enough time. I can probably go on and on about this exhibition, but I'd be happy to hear any questions about sort of the directions we're going in and so forth. And I just want to also thank Amy, who's an advisor on this exhibition. I haven't tapped on her for too much yet, but it's coming soon, Amy, I promise.
Thank you, Andrew, for the inside look. Es una primicia. Muy pocas veces uno puede saber acerca de una exposición antes de que esta fuera montada, ¿no? Entonces, muchas gracias, Andrew. So it's rare that you can hear about an exhibit while it's still in the works. So this is really exciting. Juan.
Andrew nos comenta sobre la exhibición que está trabajando. Nos cuenta también que algunas personas dicen que existen por lo menos 12 barrios chinos en Nueva York, pero esta exhibición va a tratar acerca de los 3 más grandes que se encuentran en Manhattan, Queens y Brooklyn. La exhibición se trata acerca del cambio rápido que existe y cómo los ciudadanos son o no son parte de este cambio. Tenemos imágenes de Chinatowns en diferentes barrios de Nueva York que han sido pedidas a través de artistas, ciudadanos y fotógrafos para poder documentar sus barrios. También Andrew nos cuenta sobre las redes que existen entre estos barrios, y no solo dentro de los barrios, sino también de los barrios hacia afuera e incluso con la comunidad internacional. Es así que a través de estas imágenes nos intenta contar cómo estos afectan al ambiente urbano. Por ejemplo, nos cuenta sobre una demostración del movimiento Black Lives Matter o Las Vidas Negras Importan, donde estuvieron confrontándose a un rally de policías también, que muestra las diferencias entre las generaciones. También nos comenta sobre los espacios compartidos y orientalizados, y cómo los chinos estadounidenses se relacionan con su propio barrio chino. Por ejemplo, hay barrios chinos que atraviesan la gentrificación, como el de Brooklyn, donde ahora se ha convertido en una especie de marca, donde muchos artistas viven, y es por eso que los precios están subiendo y mucha gente tiene que mudarse. Gracias.
Ok, thank you. Gracias, Juan. Queríamos compartir con ustedes unos cuantos comentarios que nos han estado llegando. I just wanted to share with you some of the comments that have been arriving through social media. Odalys Valdivieso dice, Andrew, Yuli and I are here cheering for you. Le está mandando saludos a Andrew, de sus conocidos. Marilyn White says, especially love the animations. I work for an illustrator, another level of understanding, audiovisual, and it's in multiple languages. That's great. Amy Nunez says, congratulations to all the presenters, especially my cousin, mi primo, David Eng, for such an informative session. Thank you to everyone for sharing. Oh, I'm just screen. Thank you to everyone for sharing your experience and great efforts in promoting the Chinese culture in New York. Saludos a David de su prima Amy Nunez. Stephanie Anand Zank that says Forest Hills is supposed to be becoming a Chinatown. Stephanie dice que otro barrio también se está convirtiendo en un barrio chino. Amy Nunez says, thank you to Tusanaje for organizing this very educational presentation. Great work. Rod Chem says, the Chinatown of Manhattan is a huge and incredible place. I am glad that it is so well cared for and preserved. It takes work. It takes decades of work, right? It shows. So I just, we're getting to the end of the presentation in that this is our first presentation in 2 languages, so it took a little bit longer than usual, and thank you very much for bearing with us. Ya estamos llegando al final de esta presentación y muchas gracias por mantenerse sintonizados, porque especialmente es la primera presentación que hemos hecho en 2 lenguajes, en 2 idiomas, y nos ha tomado un poquito más de tiempo. You have seen in these presentations decades of work that help to tell the story of New York, not just of Chinese Americans, but of New York, of America, and the world. How these stories are part of the story of New York, part of the story of America, part of the story of the world. Entonces, simplemente quería reafirmar que lo que han escuchado es el resultado de décadas de trabajo para asegurarse que esta historia de los chinos americanos sea contada como parte de la historia de Nueva York y como parte de la historia de Estados Unidos y como parte de la historia del mundo. Gracias, Rodrigo.
Gracias, gracias. I just want to say if David, Amy, or Andrew want to say a last word to our Peruvian Chinese community. Maybe Amy?
Any lasting thoughts? Also, just wanted to also invite the audience to write their questions in the Facebook comments. And I am going to invite David, Amy, and Andrew to maybe check within the day in the comments and see if you can address any of those that may be coming later, because some people may watch this later. Simplemente quería invitarlos a que dejen sus preguntas en los comentarios de Facebook y vamos a invitar a David, a Andrew y a Amy que visiten la página dentro de 24 horas y vean si es que hay preguntas que ustedes le han dejado. So, any parting thoughts from any of our guests?
I just want to say it's just amazing to have this program, Tusanaje. Did I say that right?
You did.
And, you know, to be connected to Chinese diaspora communities, you know, in different places. And I want to give Andrew and David a shout out because they gave me a shout out. Chinatowns couldn't exist if it weren't for talents like David and Andrew really applying themselves and, you know, returning time and again to contribute their talents to Chinatowns. And in the chat, I'm actually going to put a link to a video that Think Chinatown did, which was an interview with a man named Jan Lee, who's lived in Chinatown, his family for 5 generations, and it's called Here to Stay. And I think it'll be very meaningful for everybody who has has Chinatown in their heart. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. David, please.
Yeah, I just want to say it's how moving it is to be able to be connected to so many people all around the world. And, you know, I'm often, you know, when you, and I don't know if Amy and Andrew feel this way too, but, you know, sort of when you live in New York, sometimes you forget how large the rest of the world is and how many people are in other places. And sort of, you know, events like this really are wonderful in being able to remind us about that. So I'm grateful and thank you for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you, David. Andrew.
Yeah, I just want to echo what David and Amy have said. Thank you guys so much for inviting me. This is it just means a lot to me. You know, I feel like I'm not as interesting as you guys because my parents met in New York. But you know, this is like the first time I've gotten to address like a Peruvian community. And, you know, it's one of those things in my life. You know, I worked at a Latino center. I worked at a Mexican museum. now I'm finally at a Chinese museum where I can explore my own identity. And I had no idea it was going to direct me to the Chinese, like at the Tucson community in Lima. And it's just been really, really just fulfilling. Thank you.
Gracias, Andrew. Te esperamos en Lima con toda la comunidad Tucson. Okay, thank you, guys. That has been amazing. Thank you, Fabiana. All of you are invited to visit us here in Peru, guys, to know our Chinatowns. We also have two in Lima, the old one, traditional one from the middle of the 19th century, and the new one with the new immigration waves coming after 1980s. But of course, we have to work a lot, and you are kind of inspiration, and being here with you guys it's amazing. You are three lanes of the cultural management among Chinese American culture and New York culture. So thank you so much. And I just want to add to our audience, our Tucson audience and Chino Latino communities que nos están escuchando, yo les diría que muchas gracias por haber estado con nosotros y que tener a estos tres invitados que han expuesto de primera mano los proyectos que ellos han liderado, proyectos extraordinarios que pueden servirnos a todos como inspiración. Es importante que veamos los barrios chinos no solamente como áreas de comercio, sino como lugares donde viven personas, donde hay una historia, donde estamos rodeados de cosas muy significativas y donde, por supuesto, hay muchísimo trabajo que hacer en cuanto a gestión cultural para preservar, para que no sea todo carcomido solo por el comercio y la vida diaria y la lógica del comercio, sino que hay edificios, hay lugares, hay objetos, hay relatos, hay memorias que preservar para preservar nuestra historia y contribuir con eso a incluir nuestras historias en el gran relato de la nación, del Perú y de cualquier país de América Latina que nos esté escuchando. Les digo, en Tusanaje siempre consideramos que Nueva York y sus Chinatowns son una inspiración por todo este extraordinario trabajo que están haciendo. Entonces nos queda agradecer y agradecer a Fabiana, que si no fuera porque es una persona que tiene también muchísimo trabajo y una gran experiencia en muchos museos, ella es museóloga, y si no tuviera esa relación directa de trabajo y cooperación de años con estas tres personas, nuestro pequeño y humilde proyecto no hubiera sido capaz de tenerlos. Así que muchas gracias. Thank you, Fabi. You're amazing. So guys, thank you and see you next time. Thank you, Amy, David, Andrew. Muchas gracias. Bye-bye.
Buenas noches. Josan, no. Homan.
Homan.